Hello everyone! After her initial introduction at the end of the patch 4.2 Archon quest, Skirk will finally make her debut as a playable character in Genshin patch 5.7. Along with an updated model and amazing animations, her initial beta kit is fairly unique for a new DPS, and she is looking on the higher end of the meta as a DPS numbers wise, so let's get right into the details of her initial beta kit to see how good Skirk is looking at the moment. I will be including early calcs done by vomfee, so big thanks to him for allowing me to share his calcs. But as always, remember that both early calcs and Skirk's kit itself are by no means finals and are very subject to change. Skirk is a 5-star Cryo sword user who has sense of crit damage. Her kit has 3 unique features. First, just like Malwika, she does not use normal energy to charge her burst, but through a unique mechanic like Malwika's fighting spirit. Second, Skirk's kit allows for 2 main playstyles, an on-field main DPS or a burst DPS. And third, she has the same type of team building restrictions as Escoffier and wants to be played in freeze teams with only Hydro and Cryo characters. Instead of normal elemental energy, Skirk uses a resource called Serpent Subtlety. One way to generate this resource is through her A1 passive. When the party triggers any cryo related reaction other than melt, a void rift will spawn on the field. This can happen every 2.5 seconds and a max of 3 void rifts can be on the field at once. When Skirk absorbs these rifts, each one will give her 8 Serpent Subtlety points. She has 3 ways of absorbing these void rifts by using her other abilities, which I will highlight shortly. The other main way of Serpent Subtlety's generation is Skirk's skill. Her skill has 2 versions and allows for 2 different kinds of elemental burst, resulting in 2 different playstyles. First, holding the skill is a movement ability similar to Yelan's skill, but it also gives 45 Serpent Subtlety, resistance to interruption, and absorbs all nearby void rifts. The hold skill leads into Skirk's standard elemental burst. The burst costs a minimum of 50 Serpent Subtlety, and using it consumes all of her Serpent Subtlety to do a nuke of AoE damage. The more points she spends over the minimum of 50, the more damage the burst does, maxing the damage buff out at 62 Serpent Subtlety. This creates Skirk's burst DPS playstyle where after support skills, you hold E, ideally absorb 3 void rifts, then burst for the max amount of damage. But Skirk's primary playstyle comes from her tap skill. Pressing the skill also gives her 45 Serpent Subtlety but makes Skirk enter an enhanced state called 7-phase flash. While in this enhanced state, Skirk gains a cryo infusion with enhanced attacks that deal more damage and have a larger AoE, as well as resistance to interruption. Also, a charged attack in this state will absorb nearby void rifts. This enhanced state lasts up to 12.5 seconds but consumes 7 to 8 Serpent Subtlety every second and will end when Serpent Subtlety is fully depleted or Skirk swaps out. In addition, 7-phase flash also allows Skirk to use a special version of her burst. This burst doesn't consume any Serpent Subtlety and doesn't do any damage, but it absorbs nearby void rifts and increases the damage of her next 10 normal attacks. All this creates Skirk's on-field DPS playstyle where after support skills, you tap skill, special burst to absorb void rifts and buffer normal attacks, then spam normals, charged attack to extend her state a bit more, then end with more normal attacks. Lastly, Skirk's remaining passives buffer damage if you meet her Hydro and Cryo team building restrictions. With the A4 passive, Hydro teammates that deal Hydro damage and Cryo teammates that deal Cryo damage will give Skirk 1 stack of Death's Crossing. Skirk can have a max of 3 stacks and each party member can only give Skirk 1 stack. Each stack increases Skirk's normal attacks and burst damage, her main damage sources for her 2 playstyles. This damage buff is a motion value multiplier and not a damage percent buff, working the exact same way as Nivulette's A1 passive. This simply means that getting all 3 stacks is extremely important for Skirk's personal damage, pretty much necessitating a full Hydro Cryo comp. On top of that, her special passive gives the entire team +1 skill town level if all party members are Hydro and Cryo and you have 1 of each element, further incentivizing a full freeze team. So in summary, Skirk's kit has 2 playstyles, on-field DPS and burst DPS. On-field Skirk is played by using her tap skill, special burst, and spamming normal attacks with a charged attack in between to extend her enhanced state. The combo being assumed right now is 2 N5s, a charged attack, another N5, then an N3, totaling 18 hits from normal attacks. In the future, however, a better combo can be figured out that is consistently usable. Burst DPS Skirk is played by holding skill, using her standard burst for a huge nuke of AoE damage, then swapping out. Currently, Skirk's main and ideal playstyle is her on-field DPS one. This is even the only way Skirk can generate energy particles for the team, as hold skill doesn't generate any energy. However, TCers have started to experiment with rotations that mix both playstyles into one long rotation, so give it some time and maybe a promising split uptime rotation is created. Now let's quickly go over her constellations, as they do look pretty strong. C1 creates a 500 motion value attack for each void rift that Skirk absorbs. Assuming Skirk absorbs 5 void rifts per rotation, C1 adds a total of 2,500 500 motion value to her total damage, which is a lot. C2 gives her skill 12 additional Serpent Subtlety points, and in addition, it buffs both of Skirk's playstyles. It increases the maximum damage buff for the burst and gives 60% normal attack damage bonus while Skirk is in her enhanced state. C3 increases her burst talent level by 3. C4 adds an additional attack buff to her A4 passive. You're very likely to have a full Hydra and Cryo team, so C4 just gives Skirk 50% attack. C5 increases her skill talent level by 3, and lastly, C6 enables Skirk to gain special Havoc Sever stacks after absorbing Void Rifts, and she can spend these stacks to deal even more damage with her burst or her enhanced normal attacks. Overall, her constellations are looking quite good at the moment. For early constellations, C1 and C2 are strong for both playstyles, with C1 being one of the better C1s in the game damage-wise for an on-field Skirk. Next, let's go over Skirk's potential build options. Her signature is her clear best in slot by quite a significant margin, having a similar damage increase to her C1. Crit rate substat and the passive pretty much only works on Skirk and gives her 48% attack and 40% crit damage, just a ton of stats. Other 5-star weapon stat sticks are also good. The 3 most promising ones are Haranka Bakufutsu, Primordial Jade Cutter, and Mist Splitter. For 4-star weapons, the 2 best ones are coincidentally both free-to-play weapons. The best general weapon is the Fontaine Craftable Finale of the Deep. Most teams have a healer to heal the Bond of Life, and because Skirk doesn't get many attack buffs, the attack that this weapon gives is very good for her. The other 4-star weapon option is the 5.2 Event Sword Calamity of Ashu. While this weapon can only be used if your team has a shielder, in these teams this weapon is a pretty good option. Here is a weapon comparison done by vomfee showing the relative performances of a couple weapons. This is assuming an Escoffier Farina Yelan team, so since there's no shield, Calamity of Ashu isn't on the list. But if you are able to use it, it will be about 5% better than Finale of the Deep. For artifact sets, Skirk has 2 main choices: Finale of the Deep Galleries and Maruchusi Hunter. Finale can buff either of Skirk's playstyles and works regardless of teammates, while Maruchusi Hunter only works in a Farina team, but the crit rate can make Skirk easier to build. Performance-wise, they are quite similar with about a 3% difference between them, and which one is better mostly depends on the amount of vertical investment like weapon choice. If your weapon is a 5-star that gives crit rates such as their signature, 4-piece Finale is better. Otherwise, which is actually the majority of cases, Maruchusi Hunter is looking like the better set. For main stats, Hourglass is attack percent, Goblet is attack percent or cryo damage. Which one is better is really dependent on team and weapon, so just use the one you have better stats on, and Circlet will most likely be crit rate or crit damage, but in some cases attack percent Circlet can also be considered. Finally, let's cover Skirk's potential best teams. For the on-field playstyle, because a lot of Skirk's damage comes from fulfilling the full Hydro and Cryo teammate restriction from her passive, Escoffier is by far her most important teammate. They both fulfill each other's Hydro Cryo team building restrictions, and Escoffier brings off-field damage, off-field Cryo application, res shred, and healing. With Escoffier being a good healer, Farina is the next best Hydro support option with her off-field damage, off-field Hydro application, and fanfare buff. For the last support option, you have a couple of options. Shenhe and Yelan look to be the best final support characters. On paper, Shenhe looks to be the better support, but in practice, both should be relatively similar to each other. Sitlali is also a decent option. Even though she doesn't shred cryo, she's still a 4-piece scroll holder, a shielder, and can give TTTS to Escoffier. Funnily enough, Molani is also a potential Skirk support just because she can also hold 4-piece scroll and TTDS. Now let's talk about alternatives for these 5-star supports. Both Farina and the last support slot are fairly fine to replace. As long as you have some off-field Hydro and Cryo to consistently trigger freeze for Skirk's Void Rifts, the team will still work. For example, Xingqiu is a perfectly suitable off-field Hydro alternative, Layla can be fine for a shield, and even Dahlia, the new 4-star character releasing alongside Skirk, can be used as a strong Hydro shielder providing some attack speed as long as there is another Hydro support providing off-field Hydro. However, the biggest problem arises if we consider potential Escoffier alternatives. Because Escoffier provides so much to the freeze archetype, any replacement for her will be a big loss in damage. One option is to use Charlotte instead as the cryo healer, but then you lose out on off-field damage and a lot of res shred. Another option is to just use Shalonen for healing, comparable res shred and 4-piece scroll. However, because she isn't Hydro or Cryo, Skirk will lose out a lot of damage on her A4 passive, as well as get less uptime because less Void Rifts will be created. Even the team with double Hydro Yelan Xingqiu with Sitlali isn't looking very good. Without Escoffier, these alternatives are about a 30 to even 40% damage loss for Skirk teams, which is huge. The best looking non-Escoffier option is looking to be just using all the 5-star supports other than Farina and Escoffier that are good with her, Yelan, Shenhe, and Sitlali. However, this team is still not as good as most of the good Escoffier options, and ultimately, Escoffier is just too important of a support for Skirk at the moment. In terms of her burst DPS playstyle, there hasn't been too much TC looking into this in detail. These teams will still just be a freeze team, but instead of one of the supports, you just have another Cryo or Hydro carry, for instance Ayaka, and play a dual DPS comp where you hold skill and burst on Skirk, then swap out to your other DPS and on field with them. I'm not sure how good these teams will perform compared to just buffing the single carry, but it might be fun to try out. And that's everything on Skirk as of now. As a popular and hyped up character, there has been a lot of discourse and passionate opinions on the strength of Skirk's initial beta kit. There also has been a lot of TC and Calcs on Skirk's damage spreading around, with some varying results due to different assumptions being made. And as more time passes, Calcs are constantly changing with new info, becoming more and more accurate with things like accounting for proper rotation time. So how good of a character is Skirk actually looking like meta-wise at the moment? From the large amount of Calcs I've analyzed, Skirk is definitely not Mawika level as a DPS. Mawika is still on a tier of her own, but Skirk does have a similar damage per rotation as Mawika, just with a longer rotation time. But I think Skirk is currently most comparable with Veressa damage-wise. Depending on the theory crafter and Calcs, Skirk is either better than Veressa or slightly worse, but considering Veressa is considered the second best DPS in the game numbers-wise among TC communities, the bottom line is that Skirk is currently looking like one of the best DPSs in the game. If we compare Skirk directly with Ayaka in their best teams with Shenhe, comparing Calcs both done by vomfee, Skirk's best team has about a 12% damage per second increase, but a 22% damage per rotation increase, as the Skirk rotation is about 2 seconds longer. And while this may not seem like the biggest upgrade, Ayaka Calcs generally do not translate perfectly to real gameplay due to the inconsistency of her burst, so in practice and quality of life wise, Skirk will perform much better. But numbers aside, the biggest current issue with Skirk is her team building restriction and her reliance on Escoffier. Pretty much every single one of Skirk's passives require you to meet the full Hydra and Cryo character requirement. Otherwise, Skirk loses a lot of damage, especially because of her A4. Since Escoffier has and fulfills the same team building requirement and provides damage off your Cryo application, res shred, and healing, she's just too good of a support for her. And because any possible alternatives to Escoffier just can't compare with everything that Escoffier provides, the gap between Escoffier and non-Escoffier teams is pretty big. If you don't have Escoffier, Skirk just isn't a good DPS at the moment, plain and simple. On top of that, her teams do have their own issues, such as her supports all being very energy hungry, meaning you really need to run multiple fab weapons, and the fact that her damage is more single target oriented, especially when you consider that Escoffier and Farina are on the team. Ultimately, however, this is just her initial beta kit, so it could heavily change. Just because of the existence of Escoffier and HOYOMiX pretty clearly intending to bundle her with Skirk, I don't think the Escoffier reliance issue is going to be addressed unless Skirk has a major kit rework. So in terms of more realistic changes I want to see, I think Skirk deserves to deal a bit more damage just because of the restrictive nature of her kit. This can be done by just increasing her numbers or lowering her skill cooldown to better allow Skirk to use her burst DPS and on-field playstyles together in a split rotation. At the current moment, Skirk is looking very similar to Arlecchino, as they both have top tier animations, have a burst that they don't use in optimal gameplay, and a similar normal attack oriented kit. And we all know how Arlecchino ended up in the meta after a few patches, but we'll just have to see what happens with Skirk's kit in the upcoming weeks. I hope this initial overview and analysis on Skirk's kit was helpful to you all. Big thanks to vomfee for doing all the early beta Skirk calcs shown in this video. He's uploaded a couple Skirk TC videos on his YouTube channel and streams his calcs on Twitch, so I highly suggest checking him out, as he's a pretty solid and reliable theory crafter. I will continue to analyze any significant beta changes made to Skirk, so if you want to keep track of the beta changes, I highly recommend subbing to the channel to keep up to date with the latest beta news with TC influence analysis. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or like the video if you enjoyed. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.